I'm a member of the regional clubs team at the YAA, and we are live in Los Angeles. We are so excited. This is a really exciting moment to be here with all of you and to be back in person with the Yale Club of Los Angeles and Yale-based shared interest groups. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Anita Wu, who is the president of the Yale Club of Los Angeles, who is really helping us revitalize the Yale presence here. And we are so glad that you could be here to join us today. So Anita, come on up.
I'm Anita Wu. I'm the new incoming president of the Yale Club of LA. I graduated from Yale College in 2003, about 20 years ago, and from Yale Law School in 2006. I've been in LA ever since, and I'm a practicing attorney. I want to thank all of you for spending your afternoon here with us. Thank you to our two amazing faculty speakers for joining us. And I also want to thank the YAA representatives who helped us to organize today's event and who came out all the way from New Haven, including Stephanie Stevens and Mindy Marks. Being tasked with rebooting the regional Yale clubs and the Yale Alumni Network during a pandemic is not easy, but I think that we have exactly the right people to help us. Before introducing our first speaker, Professor Masari, I wanted to just say a few words about this event and give a little plug for our Yale Club. So first, a few words about today's event. We called it Project Connect. And I think of that as meaning two things, reconnecting and then also making new connections. So at the most basic level, as we're finally re-emerging from the pandemic, we're excited to just finally be able to reconnect with one another again, because COVID obviously physically separated us from one another, literally, as in we couldn't be with people outside of our households. And so we're excited to go back to physically interacting in person instead of over Zoom, and without the barrier of masks, enjoying meals and drinks and conversations together. And then, in addition to reconnecting in the ways that we used to, we're excited to be able to make new connections again. And that is to say that during the pandemic, I think that we pretty quickly found ways to stay at least virtually connected with the people that we most needed to be connected with, our family, our close friends, our work colleagues. We held some professional conferences and bar mitzvahs, college reunions virtually over Zoom. But one of the things that I think we were most deprived of was a forum to make new connections with people outside of our most immediate circles. And so we're very excited to resume making new connections across different purposes, different generations, demographics, professions, practices, and disciplines. I think this is particularly important for a few reasons. A lot has obviously happened in the past 2 years. I think it's become clear that we are increasingly interdependent on one another for our well-being, our success, our survival. And it's also clear that the scope and the magnitude of the new challenges and issues that we're confronted with require solutions across disciplines and industries. Another thing that has become increasingly apparent is the importance of having and maintaining thoughtful and open dialogues with people who are different from us and have differing viewpoints, right? The last few years, I think, have been very distinctive. Also for the divisiveness and the disconnection that we've experienced. There just doesn't seem to be a lot that people can agree on these days. We're polarized by our political views. We're polarized about COVID, polarized about Will Smith. We don't even necessarily agree on what is a fact and what is fake news. And on top of all of this, I think COVID changed all of our lives, but not necessarily in a unifying way, right? In very different ways, depending on our work situations and our financial situations, our family, our households. So it's not clear to me what happens next, but I think that what we can agree on is that the next step includes connecting. We badly need to connect. Reconnection to the things that were part of our world before COVID, and then new connections as we figure out what comes next and how to approach it together. So that's what Project Connect means to me. And turning to the Yale Club for a little bit, that also is really the focus of the Yale Club of LA right now. As we are working on rebuilding a new board, and working to get things going for the thousands of Yaleys in the LA area. We're excited to reconnect, to have happy hours and events, dinners, speakers. We're excited for our what we call our shared interest groups to resume their events, like for example, Yale in Hollywood, run by Kevin Winston. We're excited to make new connections like we're doing here today and learning from people. Because as different as we are, the Yale alums in this area, I think, are made up of very different people with different backgrounds, viewpoints, professions, and disciplines. And at the same time, I think we're connected by a lot. We're connected by our love of learning, our respect for differing and opposing viewpoints, and our belief that those differences should help us move forward and not just divide us. We're connected by our interest in bettering the communities that we're a part of and the inspiration that we draw from one another. These are things that I think drew us all to Yale in the first place, and then that Yale then instilled an even deeper sense of during our formative years. The last thing I'll say about the Yale Club is that at the end of the day, our alumni community is whatever we make of it. It's entirely dependent on us, each of us, to volunteer our time and energy and ideas and our commitment and our care. So we hope that you all will become actively involved by making it out to events, hosting events, or even joining the board as we try to get up and running again post-pandemic. And we hope that you'll help us start working in a way that maximizes all of our connections to the Yale community and to each other. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Lisa Masari of Yale's Department of Anthropology. She is an anthropologist of science and technology and studies how scientists build new worlds through their research and innovation. Her first book, among other publications, Placing Outer Space, an Earthly Ethnography of Other Worlds, explored the ways that planetary scientists transform planets from just scientific objects and empty voids into entire new worlds and shape our understanding of the universe. Her next book focuses on VR, but continues to ask the fundamental question of how do science and technology change what it means to be somewhere. Today, she'll be sharing the research that she's currently working on here in LA, supported by an NSF Scholars Award, which is focused on the VR industry and how the particular mix of entertainment, academic research, and industry development here shape VR and its community. She is extremely highly regarded and very popular. Her work is fascinating, and we're very excited to have her here with us.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to cling to that very popular. I think that's one of the nicest things someone's ever said about me. All right, great. The slides are up. And if any of you can't really see this, there are, I don't know why no one has sat at this beautiful table right in the center, but feel free to migrate over if you can't see the pretty pictures that will shortly grace this stage. So Yeah, I mean, it's so exciting to be in person. I've given a couple of, I think I attended the first in-person conference back in the fall, but this might be my first, talk in person for quite a while. So I hope I remember how to do it without the safety of kind of the Zoom screen. Well, I do like to begin talks the way I begin classes, which is really by getting a little bit of, participation amongst the audience. It'll be very, very brief, very painless, I promise. But the question I want to ask you all is, when you think of the word technology, what do you think of? Yes?
Things that are able to achieve a goal.
Things able to achieve a goal.
Doing.
Change.
Change. Yes?
Spending 8 hours a day making sure that sharp.
Starting that's going to actually be very relevant in just a second. So any other kind of words that come to mind? Yes?
Making things easier to do.
Making things easier to do. Yes?
A great servant but a terrible master.
Ooh, okay, I like that. We're going to get back to that at the end, I think. So the question that I'm coming to you today is this. Is technology a universal concept? We just generated a bunch of words and ideas in this room together, and the question is, if I was in any room, anywhere, would those words be the same? Would we have the same idea of what technology is and isn't? So certainly we know that technology changes in its implementation from place to place. If you've ever traveled internationally, you know you have to bring a little baggie of chargers to do the exact same thing you would at your home in the United States as a different country that you're traveling in. So certainly how technology is executed changes through a lot of variety from place to place. But the question I'm asking is slightly different. It's whether the concept of technology is the same. These set of associations that we have for that word, are they the same everywhere? Is that universal? So to even ask that question actually is very much informed by my background as an anthropologist. So as an anthropologist, we study culture. And in culture, we're very aware that concepts rarely have universal definitions. So if you think of something like food, food is not a universal concept. Something like horse meat is considered food in some areas and not considered food in other areas. Likewise, beauty is not universal. The beauty standards are different from place to place, from time to time. You can say the same for health, for humor. Cultural concepts tend to be local, tend to be specific. So it's a little bit more challenging to ask that question about universality and locality about the idea of technology. Because we often think of technology as distinct from culture, as science and technology often are imagined as outside of culture, as apart from culture. But as an anthropologist of science and technology, our core tenet is that there are many aspects of technical and scientific practice that are indeed cultural, that are saturated by culture. And so if we begin to think of technology as part of culture, then we can really get back to this question of whether technology is a universal concept, and again begin to ask it and answer it in the same way we would all of those other cultural concepts, like beauty, like humor, like food. So for the talk today, I'm going to walk through actually how I even came to this question, because this was in fact an unexpected question, an outcome of my research. And I'm going to do so by giving you a little bit more introduction about where I came up with this concept, my own background. Then I'm going to offer some insights from the current book I'm working on. The book is titled In the Land of the Unreal, Virtual Reality, Los Angeles, and the Fantasy of Technology Otherwise. I'm going to give a couple findings from that book that are all about the insights I gained once I began thinking about technology as a local concept. And I'm going to end very briefly with implications of thinking about technology as a local and flexible category, and how that might kind of help us to imagine slightly different technological futures than perhaps the ones we're being offered today. So how does one become an anthropologist of technology? This is not something that's really on the, on the course bulletin when you're scanning for options. For me, I began as an engineer. I was a STEM kid. I really loved astronomy and astrophysicists in high school, and I went to MIT where I studied aerospace engineering for my bachelor's. But I took a couple years off after undergrad, and when I went back for my PhD, I did return to MIT. But at that point, I decided I wanted to study the history and anthropology of science and technology. I realized what really fascinated me about scientific and technical work were actually all of the non-technical aspects around it. Why do scientists do what they do? Where do they find their passions? How does the scientific findings and technology influence our lives and how we live in this world? So my first book, which was published in 2016, and as was explained in my introduction, was with planetary scientists and astronomers, and very much about this idea of world making, building worlds not only on Earth, but on other planets. And as I was concluding that research, I was wondering what was another science and technological pursuit that was also changing how we think about the world and how we think about what it means to be a human in the world. And this was in 2015. And serendipitously, as I was driving home from work one day, listening to the radio, it was an episode of the TED Talk Radio Hour. And it included an interview with the filmmaker Chris Milk, who was talking about virtual reality, something I hadn't maybe thought of ever. And had I thought about it, it might have been in the 1990s at some point, but I hadn't really been aware of what this technology was today. And in this talk, the TED Talk itself was titled, How Virtual Reality Can Create the Ultimate Empathy Machine. And I'm not going to talk too much about that idea of empathy, but happy to do so in the Q&A or the conversation after. But he had this intriguing line in this talk, which is that VR is a machine that makes us more human. So as an anthropologist, that was very intriguing, and I wanted to learn more. So starting in the fall of 2015, I began following the developments of VR, and this was at kind of a real crescendo of the hype cycle around virtual reality. That's because in 2014, Facebook had spent $2 billion buying the VR company Oculus which was a Southern California startup by Palmer Luckey, who is jumping with joy over there. And there was just a whole lot of excitement around what this technology could be now that the computer graphics had caught up, that the hardware was good. What kind of stories could you tell? What you can really immerse yourself and be in this world. And so as I began kind of constructing what a research project for me in this area would be like, two things really struck me when I began starting to pay attention to the conversation around VR in the 2010s. The first was that there was an explicit conversation happening about the role of women and underrepresented voices in VR as an industry. There was a hope, an imagination, an intention to let VR be a slightly different kind of industry, different from tech on the one side and entertainment on the other side, both of which are quite hierarchical and which has taken a long time for women to make inroads in these industries. The imagination was because VR was a bit newer, a bit more nimble, maybe it could be a different kind of industry, a better kind of industry that had different leaders and different voices represented. So that was one thing that really intrigued me when I started paying attention to VR. The other thing was, whenever I would hear someone talk about a project that I was interested in, I would see where they were located or where their company was located, it was in Los Angeles. This is not something I expected. I was expecting I would have to go to Silicon Valley and I've already done research there, it's fine, I'd go back if I had to. But as soon as I realized that maybe I'd get to spend time in the land of palm trees, I was incredibly excited because, to be honest, I didn't know there was a technology scene here. And I certainly didn't know that this is where VR was happening. And especially because as a born and bred East Coaster, I just knew nothing about Southern California. And that's an ideal position for an anthropologist to be in. We love going to exotic places and trying to make sense of them. And the way we do that is by spending a long period of time in a place. So I lived in LA for the calendar year of 2018, doing anthropological research. That's a long-term immersion. And I was particularly focused on the VR community here, and particularly this movement of women in VR and underrepresented voices in VR, and endeavors that weren't just about gaming, but we're really trying to understand if VR can make us better humans. This VR for good emphasis. So that research that I did in 2018 is what the rest of the talk is going to be focused on. And particularly, I'm going to draw out 3 insights that I gained from my research that are documented in more depth in the book, but here I'll just give you a taste for them. And all about kind of learning that I did when I began thinking about VR as a local concept, when I began questioning if technology is a universal concept. And so the reason I even began asking that question is when I arrived here in 2018 and I started meeting with folks I had contacted through the Women in VR Facebook group, saying I was interested in people who were working in VR. I was having all these wonderful coffees and meals where people were saying how excited they were to be a woman in tech. And I would ask, great, so what do you do? What are you working on? It's like, oh, I'm actually an assistant. Or, you know, I'm an influencer, or I'm an evangelist of VR. And as someone who was an anthropologist studying technology, I became very nervous. What if there actually wasn't technology here? And I couldn't quite figure out, there was all these people telling me that they were excited to be in tech. And you know, I'm someone who I feel like I know what tech is. I went to MIT, I had spent time in Silicon Valley. I felt like I knew what tech was. And people were saying they were working in technology, but it wasn't something I recognized from my previous experience as technology. And I was almost in a panic, thinking I'd have to just pack up and go home. But then I remembered I was an anthropologist, and the thing that an anthropologist does is when they're encountered with something they don't understand, they just work harder to understand it. You believe what you're being told. So if I was being untold that this was tech work, I had to start thinking that perhaps tech work looked different in LA than it looked in other places I had worked and studied. So that became this incredibly generative question to say, what does tech mean here? And how is that different from what it means elsewhere? And I began by thinking, if tech was local, if this concept of technology was local, then how did LA shape VR? How did Los Angeles influence the kind of ideas and projects on VR that were coming out during this time? So, as I said, the very first thing I did was I began meeting with different people in the VR community all around the city. And I had one really memorable meal in Koreatown, so not far from here, with Chris, who was a VR producer, and 2 of her collaborators, Hugo and David. And we were just kind of nerding out together about all things immersive technology. So that not only includes virtual reality, it includes augmented reality, immersive theater, location-based entertainment. And we were all kind of just collectively excited about what the different potentials were for experiences in which you could fully immerse yourself in them, can fully be part of the storytelling. And at some point, Hugo became interested in what I was doing here. Like, oh right, there's an anthropologist with us. Maybe I should figure out a little bit more about her project. Now, Hugo worked at Oculus when it was still based in Irvine, and then when it got acquired by Facebook, he had moved up to Silicon Valley. So he'd worked in both the LA scene and the VR scene, and the San Francisco VR scene for a while, and he was back in LA working on augmented reality. And when he asked, he's like, oh, you're an anthropologist of technology. Why are you in Los Angeles? And again, I had been asking myself this question quite a bit. I kind of stumbled and said something to the effect of, oh, I'm more interested in content development than hardware development. And he kind of paused and apologized because what he was about to say was going to be cheesy, and said that he felt that LA, rather than San Francisco, was going to be where VR's potential was realized. And when I asked him why, he responded that LA has always been about fantasy. And that stuck with me, and I began wondering how a city so steeped in fantasy might influence the technology that's being created here. So again, even though people don't think of technology as being in Los Angeles, that itself is a fantasy. Tech has been here for a long time, throughout the 20th century, of course. And as I began researching the history of high technology in Los Angeles, I began to see similarities between the way that entertainment and the tech industry had about thinking and problem solving. And so I would augment Hugo's quote to say that yes, LA has always been about fantasy, but it has always been about a particular way of blending fantasy and reality when it comes to the projects being conceived of and implemented here. And to kind of illustrate what I mean by this, we're going to go back to the mid-20th century, and I'm going to kind of do a very brief comparison of two futurists of that moment. One of them you will recognize, Walt Disney. So we often think of Walt Disney, of course, as an entertainer, but he was also someone who was really passionate about understanding the relationship between technology and society. There's two anecdotes from his life I will share with you to kind of illustrate what I mean. So first is when he was producing Fantasia. He had a very specific sense of the sound he wanted, the sound quality he wanted to make in the theater, and he couldn't quite implement it with what was currently on offer. So he contracted a small startup to produce the oscillators that he wanted for the sound of Fantasia. And this was a small company, didn't even have a contract yet, but he contracted them for the tech he needed, and this company was Hewlett-Packard. And it's when they were still in the garage, and Disney was the first contract, which allowed them to get out of the garage, which is often thought of as the birthplace of Silicon Valley. So LA has always also influenced the tech scene up north as well. But additionally, Disney also decided that after his lifetime of being an entertainer, he wanted to give people a different way of living in the world. And he conceptualized the experimental prototype city of tomorrow, which he imagined as a city that kind of capitalized on the best that technology had to offer to make our lives easier and better. That, of course, was Epcot, and he died before he could have it realized as an actual city, and instead it became, of course, a theme park. So Disney always was a futurist, always was interested in blending fantasy and reality when thinking about tomorrow, thinking about the future. And I'm comparing him to a contemporary who you'll probably be less familiar with. So this is Herman Khan. So Herman Khan is probably most famous for the book he wrote on thermonuclear war. And he was a physicist and an engineer. And after World War II, he became one of the founders of the Rand Corporation, which was headquartered in Santa Monica. And at Rand, they were interested in trying to think about what different futures might look like, particularly futures that were thermonuclear in nature. This feels a little bit more familiar than I would like it to at this moment, but at Rand Corp, they developed a particular way of thinking called scenario planning. And scenario planning also is indebted to Hollywood. So the word scenario is actually drawn from the silent film era, where instead of scripts, you had scenarios to kind of think about how a scene might unfold, how a future might unfold. And it's because they had a freelancer who was a screenwriter doing some of the copy edits on their materials, and he kind of heard what the engineers and physicists were up to, and he said, you know, guys, this sounds like scenarios from the silent film era. And so that language from Hollywood worked its way into what is a very prominent part of game theory and kind of thinking about our political and technological futures. But perhaps what you'll best know Khan for is the fact that he was the inspiration for Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's movie. So he is he's part of our mind and our consciousness about what a particular kind of mad scientist looks like. So again, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there is a lot of sharing between the entertainment industry and the technology industry, not only today with multimedia, but way back into the 20th century. And that one of the most, what I found in my research, one of the most impactful ramifications from this is a particular way of thinking that blends fantasy and reality, that is oriented towards certain kinds of futures that want to kind of capitalize on a technologically saturated world. But toward the end of the 20th century, things began changing in terms of the industrial landscape in Los Angeles, especially after the Cold War. The aerospace and defense firms, which had been abundant here in the mid-century, began closing. The software manufacturing complex, which had kind of started rising in the 70s and 80s, began going offshore. And so this kind of aerospace defense electronics complex that Khan very much represents began getting hollowed out, even as entertainment began to rise and further dominate. And so you get a little bit of an emptiness. And that's precisely when, as the 20th century tipped over into the 21st century, that virtual reality came to Los Angeles. And part of the argument I'm making is that precisely because of this way of thinking that blends fantasy and reality, when VR arrived here, the groundwork was already laid for the potential of its success. So indulge me in another little historical interlude, which is how did VR even get here? It certainly didn't start here. In fact, it started back in at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts with Ivan Sutherland, who probably built the first prototype of a head-mounted display in which you could enter a computer-generated world. And this was in the early 1960s. As you can imagine, computer graphics, not that they weren't good, they didn't exist yet. And in fact, Ivan Sutherland spent the rest of his career developing computer graphics at the University of Utah. So he kind of he kind of planted the seed of what it might be like to be able to enter a virtual world, but didn't execute it in his lifetime. At about the same time, at an Air Force base in Ohio, Tom Furness began experimenting also with head-mounted displays, and particularly how pilots can be trained through computer simulation. So he began developing scenarios for flight simulator planning, but because he was doing this kind of in a military context, a lot of the work that he was doing wasn't well known until long after he was kind of executing really pioneering head-mounted displays and computer simulations. Furness eventually moved also to a university. He went to the University of Washington, where he continues to this day to do very influential of today really does come from the Bay Area in the 80s and 90s. And I kind of want to highlight Scott Fisher as one of the primary kind of movers and shakers in the scene. He actually also migrated over from the East Coast from Cambridge, and he arrived at NASA in the 80s, and through the early 90s kind of began building on the work that was already done by Sutherland, by Furness, and he partnered with Jaron Lanier, who had started a company called VPL. And Lanier, in 1986, coined the phrase virtual reality. And he was building a glove that could interface with a computer-generated world. And Fisher was able to combine that with the headset he was building, such that for the first time, you finally had the opportunity to put on a headset, enter a computer-generated world, and interact with it, move around with it, manipulate it. In the late 80s and the 90s, the VR hype in the Valley was out of this world. This was the most exciting thing. People would come to NASA to try out Fisher's gear and would go away with their minds blown, completely psyched on this technology and what its potential were. But it was actually still a little bit early. And even though a couple commercial companies started in the 90s for virtual reality, they all kind of faded. Maybe some of you remember the Virtual Boy, which was Nintendo's attempt. I see blankness, so no. That's about how VR, commercialized in the 90s. It did not. So when you get towards the end of the 90s, it's a bit of a problem. There was a lot of excitement about virtual reality and hope for its future, but the pathway for R&D was not clear. So some research went back into the laboratory. Jaron Lanier went up to Microsoft in Seattle, but Scott Fisher went down to Los Angeles. And it's because in Los Angeles, again, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a proposal for how to keep VR R&D going in this time period. And this gets back to this blending of fantasy and reality that LA is so known for. So the Department of Defense actually issued a report and held a series of talks in which it acknowledged that who are two parties that might care about VR? Well, military on the one hand, and entertainment on the other hand. So perhaps if VR were to succeed, it needed both industries to buy in, to kind of collaborate and jointly fund the next wave of VR R&D. And indeed, that's what happened with a $45 million grant to USC to build the Institute of Creative Technologies, where a ton of incredibly important research on VR happened in the early 2000s. And it's out of USC that you get people like the journalist Anita Wu, Chris Milk, who I talked about right at the beginning, and Palmer Luckey, who founded Oculus. That was all coming out of LA in the 2010s. And though I'm not going to talk about it here, I want to highlight Nani de la Peña's role. I think she's less well known in the community than, say, Chris Milk and Palmer Luckey, but is, I would say, the most important person in VR's resurgence in the 2010s. So all of a sudden, LA and its way of blending fantasy and reality found the traction that VR was looking for. And we begin to get the moment that I entered the field in 2018, where it seemed like there was a ton of possibility for VR to be the next great thing, both in entertainment, but also in our lives. And it's really, I would argue, this kind of blending of fantasy and reality that distinguishes Los Angeles' tech scene, but also made it an incredibly fertile place for a technology like VR, leveraging entertainment, leveraging kind of military and defense work to really emerge. But then the question we're faced with is that if Silicon Valley kind of failed to make VR a success in the 1990s, would Los Angeles be able to do so in the 2010s? And in fact, the success was not that easy. When I got to LA in 2018, there were still a lot of people working in the field, but they were, I would say, frustrated. They didn't understand why this technology, which the hardware was great, the graphics was incredible, the mode of storytelling was really maturing. It felt like all the pieces were there, and yet it wasn't achieving the kind of widespread, ubiquitous success that everyone was hoping for. And again, people in LA kept on pointing a finger up north and saying it's their fault. It's the people in Silicon Valley why this isn't succeeding. And I'm sure had I done research in Silicon Valley, they would have been pointing the finger right back here. There was a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem happening between LA and San Francisco. And I'll just illustrate this very briefly with, I had met an LA-based venture capital investor who had a VR fund. He was interested in funding early stage VR companies and projects. And he had just come back from an event called XR on the Bay. And this was an event held in Silicon Valley meant to bring together people in tech and entertainment, particularly around XR, which is virtual reality, augmented reality, and other immersive tech. And I remember talking to this LA-based investor, and he was just mystified by the pitches he had received during that conference. He kind of talked about one engineer coming into the room to pitch his company, and kind of came away just calling, not knowing even how to describe it, just calling it weird. Like, to him, this was someone that just didn't get it, didn't understand how Hollywood worked, and therefore didn't understand how VR worked. And again, people kept telling me that it was up in San Francisco and the fault up there for why VR was not succeeded. This is, of course, a very convenient thing to tell ourselves. But what I began taking away from it is that it seemed there was a different understanding of technology in LA than San Francisco. And not only was tech local, but these local differences began to matter when it came to understanding either how to make VR succeed or why it wasn't quite succeeding. So again, perhaps it's surprising that someone in LA might have the audacity to claim that someone in Silicon Valley didn't get technology, right? It seems like often the blame is placed the other way. But at the same time, technology has always been part of the entertainment industry. One could tell the history of entertainment as a history of technology, or particularly the history of movie making as a history of technology. Not only did it begin the proof of concept with Edison's Black Maria and actually being able to capture motion picture, but so many other of the developments throughout the 20th century that enhanced movies' storytelling was pioneered by, of course, engineers. Technicolor was founded by MIT alumni and professors, and even something like Pixar was initially founded by engineering students at New York Institute of Technology, folded into Lucasfilms, but then it was Steve Jobs who bought Pixar and transformed it into the studio that it is today. So throughout Hollywood's history, there is a strong legacy of dealing with and innovating what I am calling cinematic technologies. And part of what I began to understand in my research is that this local difference between LA and San Francisco in terms of how the two locations understood technology was a difference in thinking about technology as a cinematic technology versus thinking about technology as an emerging technology. Something like personal robots or flying cars or the future of screens. If you think about that as distinct from, color processing or computer animation, you begin to see that there's kind of two different ways of thinking about technology in these two different places. And fascinating for me is that VR sat in the middle. VR is something that could both be thought about as a cinematic technology and both be thought about as an emerging technology. And this just wasn't the case for a lot of previous technologies before it. So when I talk about VR as a cinematic technology, what I mean is that it is a technology that assists in telling stories. We can see this in something like virtual production. Here is Steven Spielberg donning a VR headset to location scout in a CG-created environment for his movie Ready Player One, which was of course about virtual reality. But also, VR as a cinematic technology follows in the lineage of something like color and sound, each of which promise to create a more immersive story. That's exactly what VR is promising as a cinematic technology, to bring you into the story, to be more immersive. So on the other hand, VR is also an emerging technology, meaning a technology for which there's multiple consumer uses and also has kind of broad-scale societal and ethical implications if we imagine a world in which it is kind of taken up in abundance. So VR could be seen as the future of surgery or the future of urban planning or even the future of therapy. But it can also be seen as VR having a future in which perhaps we're a little bit more isolated from each other. And what I kind of began understanding about VR is there's just these two very different ways of understanding VR as a technology. And these two different ways, cinematic versus emerging, map onto the geography between Southern California and Northern California. So this is part of that implication of there being different local meanings and understandings of technology. In LA, there was a lot of strategies and expertise in developing cinematic technology. And in San Francisco, there was a lot of strategies and expertise for developing emerging technology. And VR was both of these things. And therefore, it actually made it really hard to see that there were these different local meanings that were in conflict with each other. And that's precisely because of one of the points I made at the beginning, which is that we think of technology as universal, as meaning the same thing everywhere. And so because everyone was referring to VR just as technology, right, this language of cinematic versus emerging is something that I've only been able to kind of think about and articulate in retrospect. It felt like everyone was talking about the same thing, that VR and technology was universal, but really there were distinct local meanings and local expertise. And this was well articulated for me by someone I worked with. I did a residency at the Technicolor Experience Center where they were developing immersive technology. And she well articulated a difference between Hollywood and Silicon Valley. She said, we build dreams in Hollywood, and we understand how content is made. In San Francisco, it's very technology driven. Silicon Valley is about building platforms and technologies of scale, and Los Angeles is about fantasy and fiction and nonfiction and storytelling and interactivity and pulling those worlds all together. You need to have to start VR from somewhere, and so it's just a natural evolution to start from the entertainment industry. So this person was clearly very astute at these geographical differences, but she really thought of VR only as a cinematic technology and didn't entirely recognize that there were some skills and expertise that you need for VR to succeed, which would come from thinking about VR as an emerging technology. So, whereas I've kind of so far talked a little bit about how perhaps technology having local meanings is a hindrance to its success, it created some of this friction, I also want to kind of give a slightly different take on it, which is having a local flexible meaning of technology also allows for a little bit of triumph, a way to think about technology differently, and therefore to think about who could be a tech worker also as differently. So in other words, there is possibility in embracing the flexibility of technology. And I'll be very brief here, but this is well illustrated by one of those things that initially brought me to Los Angeles, which is the prevalence of women in VR, and this kind of conversation that VR could be a different kind of industry with different kind of leaders. Now, I just want to briefly note that I did my fieldwork in 2018, and of course, the revelations about Harvey Weinstein was in the fall of 2017, right before I got to LA. So I kind of arrived here at the peak of the Me Too movement, and then very much shaped the kind of conversations that were being had all over Los Angeles, but particularly within the VR industry. And again, what I'm trying to kind of illustrate in this point is a lesson I learned during my fieldwork, which is that tech meant something different here, and therefore being a woman in tech was slightly more accessible because there was an expanded meaning of what technology was that mapped to the expertise already in Los Angeles, the cinematic technology expertise. And I just kind of want to give a series of quotes that reflect how women felt about the kind of empowerment they had in working in VR and therefore working in close proximity to technology and therefore being able to claim a woman in tech kind of moniker. So as one woman who had trained in, who went to school to study film said, I always wanted to be a lady in tech. And you know, their training, their education didn't really give them the skills that are normally thought of as technological skills, such as development or software engineering. But suddenly, because VR was also a cinematic technology, she could be in tech and feel that excitement and power from being from working in this field. Here is another quote, which is, this is someone who had developed a really early VR game. And actually just did voiceover work for the game. But she said, after that experience and being female, I became somebody who could sit on a panel and talk about virtual reality. All of a sudden, I became an expert in something that I am not an expert in. And I heard this from a number of people, which is there was because VR felt new, particularly in Los Angeles, there was an opportunity to kind of accelerate one's career faster than in kind of the traditional entertainment hierarchy that someone like Ashley would have had to go through. So suddenly she could have a lot more prominence and be a thought leader, more so than she would in the form of work that she had originated in. And then this is from an immersive sign designer, and talking just about why she finds power in identifying as a woman in tech. She says, we're trying to take up space in something that's not very welcoming, learning to code or learning a new skill. It's like, all right, I'm entering into this hostile environment where I know all the stats are against me, but I want to do it anyways. So I think people wear being a woman in tech as a badge of honor. We're challenging the norm. So there was also kind of a political sensibility or desire that came from identifying as a woman in tech. And I just want to quote a little bit more from Victoria, because I found her to be really insightful in terms of when she, as someone coming from entertainment, began thinking of her work as tech work, that shifted some things around. So the cool part about tech in LA, and this is again coming from Victoria, is that it inherently merges with entertainment. They influence each other in a positive way. It's kind of like the early days of computing where there are no rules. And so we're making the rules as we go. So everyone's an inventor. Everyone's bringing their unique perspectives to the table to see how we can better tell stories. And what I find really fascinating and striking about this quote is the way in which she kind of seamlessly moves between this idea of being an inventor and this idea of being a storyteller. Because what was happening in the VR community was that storytelling was becoming technical work. Storytelling was becoming a form of innovation. And that is part of what allowed the category of technology to expand and to become different from how it might appear or be enacted in Silicon Valley. So I'm gonna wrap up here. The reason I highlighted the quotes before of all these women is because they were hopeful. And as someone who studies technology from a critical lens, we're very short on hope these days. There's been a lot happening when it comes to thinking about technology and its role in our lives. Big tech is kind of run amok these days. We are aware of the problems of biased algorithms. There's privacy concerns, there's manipulation of social media, there's ongoing failures to regulate these companies and these platforms, and there's the problem of the spread of misinformation that led to some of the divisiveness that that has already been mentioned. So thinking about technology in a hopeful way, we're short on models for it at the moment. But part of what I find inspirational here is that big tech mode of doing things, the current kind of challenges we face now in terms of how technology and society interface, that doesn't have to be the role technology necessarily plays in society. And so VR for me serves as just a case study in a larger way of thinking about different futures and thinking about how we might change our relationship in technology to go about achieving those different futures. So the lesson I learned in Los Angeles very much showed how a local meaning of technology was able to expand the concept's associations, and this was able to lead to the fantasy of VR being a different and better industry. Now, this fantasy didn't entirely become reality, but it was successful in that it serves as a reminder that technology and the tech sector can be different than what has come before. So, thinking about the current future that's on offer, VR is very much on the center of it. Now this thing called the metaverse, and it's being coupled with crypto, with NFTs, with DAO, with DeFis. I just heard another one, a CeFi. I don't even know what that one is. I haven't had a chance to Google yet. But there is this headlong rush into building and dominating what is being called Web3. And we're being told a very specific future. But the argument here is that that is only one possible future. There can be other futures. There can be other ways of engaging with technology. And so the anthropological lesson here is that technology is part of culture. It is therefore something that we can shape. And I don't think we'll create change simply by redefining what technology is at a local level. But this is at least a start and a helpful reminder that technology is flexible and can mean any number of things. So increasingly, I am encouraging students and patient audiences to think more expansively about what technology is and to push back on some of the less desirable futures that are being imagined by dominant companies. And these are futures that I consider to come from narrow and local understandings of technology. So technology is not a universal concept, and the future of our social engagement with technology can certainly be impacted by local actions. So thank you. Sure, yeah.
Okay, well, you guys will let me do this, or okay, cool. So thank you so much, Professor Masari. How lucky are we that she was just happened to be here in Los Angeles when we asked her to come and speak today? That hasn't happened a lot in the last couple of years, so we're excited.
We like luck, right? When we get it, it's good.
Yes. So we have time for maybe one or two questions, and then we'll of course have to talk back at the end. So if anyone has a question they would like to ask right now, I can weave my way through the crowd, or we can save it for later. Oh God. Okay, I'm gonna go this way. All right, I'll hold this for you, okay?
Well, mine is really tiny. Okay. But when monkeys use rocks to open clams, is that the same kind of technology? First of all, are you calling that technology? And if I understand that as technology, how is it implicated with regard to this stuff we were talking about, the combining of the hardware with the stories?
Well, so Jane Goodall, a famous primatologist, she was the person who kind of made the observation that primates other than humans use tools in their environment to achieve social ends, whether that's feeding or becoming more comfortable. So this idea that technology is not only a human category is something that anthropologists, particularly primate anthropologists, have been accustomed to thinking of for a while. I have not thought about this. This is not quite in my research. So I would have to think a lot more before I gave an answer as to how, from a primatology perspective, this melding of technology would work. So I will certainly ponder it.
Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna do just one more, and we'll talk at the end.
Hi, Kevin Winston. Thanks so much. I run Yale in Hollywood and Digital LA. We've been organizing events around women in tech and women in VR since 2015. That's when, like you said, it really got started. There's also a Facebook group called Women in VR LA, which has 10,000 members. So if anybody's inspired by this conversation to get into VR, whether you're a woman or a guy, you can join the group. But it's woman focused. Everything is very woman focused in the group, which is just refreshing, like you said. It's a new paradigm that was created. If people want to get more involved in VR, should they pick up an Oculus? What do you suggest as far as getting involved? Oh, also just shout out, there's a Yale who has a VR health company in Los Angeles, so it's not just entertainment, but also VR too. So anyway, let's get a shout out to the locals who are doing that. But yeah, if people want to get involved in VR, what should they do? Pick up an Oculus? Well, I guess pick up a Meta. What should they do?
Great question. Well, first of all, I will say I attended some of your Digital LA events while I was doing fieldwork, and you made me ask a question at one of them, which I'll never forget what I gave you for. Exactly, tables have turned. It's an interesting question of how to get involved in VR at this moment. So in 2015, 2016, 2017, I would have said it's very easy. You go to a meetup, you meet some folks, everyone needed talent, needed creative energy, and like it really just wasn't that hard to get some kind of entry-level position, even if you didn't have much skill or talent. Everyone had talent, but even if you didn't have much of the needed expertise, it's so different now. Because already some of the kind of boundary work that happens when an industry is going through formation has happened. And so the barrier to entry is so much higher now than it was even a few years ago. And the pandemic has also turned it all upside down. But I would say if VR is something interesting, like yeah, absolutely get a headset, right? You can get a Meta Quest for about $300, $200, and it's a good headset. And you can not only do games and other things, but there's a ton of really amazing interactive storytelling for free on the headset. And you can also begin exploring some of the social VR worlds, which I haven't spent much time in because there's big harassment issues in them, but nonetheless are really experimenting in what these online worlds and online sociality might look like. And honestly, that's a space in which fresh ideas are needed in terms of what that future looks like. So kind of part of what I was saying, even though this might not be a path to immediate revenue, if you are interested in VR, kind of social VR is a place that needs a lot of help in terms of figuring out how it'll work effectively. And if you can like hop in there and just start tweeting about it, like there's probably enough people who need those ideas and will start listening. So that's a great question. I'm sure you have some ideas as well. So you should all go to talk to Kevin about that after.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I can tell everyone's like a little itchy because no one has been sitting for this long for a very long time working from home. So if you need to get a cup of coffee, please feel free. The restrooms are right outside. But I do also want to introduce our next speaker. We're all friends here, so it's okay if you need to get up, we understand. Our next speaker is Marcos Luis, who is the Vice President of the Yale Club of LA, who is going to tell us a little bit about our next faculty member. So Marcos.
Thank you so much. I just want to say first, just thank you to Stephanie Stevens. Thank you to Vinnie Marks, because this is a long way to come from New Haven, especially as we're reaching the tail end of this pandemic. That is a big deal to us here. And thank you to Anita Wu for being the first president for this revitalization of the Yale Club, because we started this like in the middle of a pandemic. Some of us were baking bread, you know, some of us were learning a new skill, and it was quite something special to have the YA kind of reach out and have alumni reach out to maintain the sense of community across the nation, and to meet alumni via Zoom, if we were meeting it over Skype, and who really wanted that same thing. And to me, just meeting people from Delaware, from New Hampshire, what have you, wow, that was amazing to still have talks going on. And it's times like this, times like right now, when a sense of community is so important. I'm so excited to be the VP in this next generation of the Yale Club, because I feel like, as a coach would say, we have such a deep bench of talent across class years and experiences here, because we have such a unique diversity of experiences like no other, because we have alumni across so many industries in Los Angeles: entertainment, nonprofits, biomedical research, you name it, literature, music, animation, right here in the Southland. And that to me is so special, and it makes me so excited about the potential of the Yale Club for creativity, for big ideas, and the imagination that could create something new. because it's these meetings of the minds, these conversations right here. That's where the magic happens. And it's a privilege to see you all here and to talk to some of you the way I have before this. And it's so wonderful, as we're coming out of this whole stage that we've been in, that we can have those conversations again. In a city like ours, with an endless variety of multi-hyphenate talents, our next speaker is no exception. As a producer, showrunner, and writer across multiple award-winning shows, such as Under the Dome, Designated Survivor, SVU, and ER, Dr. Barrett has shaped compelling stories that capture the imagination. As a documentary producer, he has overseen groundbreaking work, such as Home is Where You Find It, and Welcome to Chechnya, winner of the Special Jury Award at Sundance and the Peabody Award. But as a physician and practicing doctor, he has grounded these experiences with the eye of a medical professional, innovating portrayal and accuracy of medicine on screen by piloting efforts to get writers access to real medical resources. He has started award-winning initiatives such as the Hollywood Health and Society program at USC and a UCLA initiative promoting global health understanding in new media. He is a professor at the Harvard Medical School at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine and at the Yale School of Public Health. And he is co-teaching this semester Yale's inaugural Humanities, Arts, and Public Health practice, also called a Happy Course, exploring how engagement in music, art, and cultural events lead to better health. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Neil Barrett.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here back in LA. I was here for 27 years starting with ER. I was a fourth year medical student when ER was just getting started. And I was thinking about Mr. Masari's great talk and how it really got me thinking about technology and its influence on the work that I've done. So when I did my first show was China Beach. Maybe some of you remember it. We had film bins. We cut film with blades. We had an orchestra that did the music, and now everything is acoustic, pretty much, but by computer. We don't cut film. We don't use grease pencils to make the film, blow it up or to pan. We can do all of the director's work, which sometimes they don't like, through the computer. I can go in and if the director forgot to push in, I can push in, I can blow up, I can reverse the film, I can turn it around, I can make it different colors, I can do amazing things. And yet one wonders, is the content any better? But we can certainly do a lot of things with the technology. ER started with the Steadicam. So we were able to run down hallways, we were talking about this, and do all what we called one-ers and handoffs because we had the technology to do it. So here's where technology was enabling us to tell stories in a different way. There'd be no West Wing with those walk-and-talks without ER, same producer John Wells, because we had done ER with the walk-and-talks. I was thinking about when I did SVU and we started out with blackboards and then dry erase boards and then iPads at the crime scene and then GPS and taking the lab to the crime scene. And this was all motivated by technology, and the changes helped me in telling stories in, I hope, a fresher way. I also thought about how the stories themselves took technology. So for instance, I believe we were amongst the first where Mariska Hargitay's character swabs the inside of her mouth and sends the DNA out and asks for a 50% match. Nobody was asking for 50% matches. I read about this kind of in a psych journal about what would you do if you were looking for a match and you reduced it down to 50% instead of 99%. Maybe you would find some family members. Of course, now this is happening. There are a lot of civil liberty questions involving that and kind of digging through different DNA databases to look for people who've committed crimes. We've actually solved crimes by taking pizza boxes, looking at the DNA, or arresting someone, putting them through the system, putting their DNA through the system, getting a 50% match, and then, you know, catching somebody in South Central LA who had committed many murders because we had a match with his son. So we did that with Mariska before people were doing it. She found her brother because her character was the product of her mother being raped, and she wanted to find out, could she find her father, and ultimately she did. So this was really based on technology driving new ways to tell stories. And so I'm always thinking about the technology, not only in doing special effects as we did on the show Under the Dome, but how does the technology really shape the storytelling in new ways and keep the show fresh. So it's not just a unidirectional technology makes for better special effects, but stories take technology and are told in new ways, up to Nani de la Peña's work, where you actually go into a virtual reality and experience sometimes really frightening social issues like domestic violence, for instance. So there's a whole world waiting to really be explored, and I think it's really helpful to think about storytelling in a multi-directional way, that it's using technology to advance the way we can tell stories and use new ways to integrate music or editing. It's also how do we tell the story, as I just illustrated with Mariska's character, using technology to push that character's own story forward. So I'm thinking about those things all the time as I do my shows. In fact, when I did Designated Survivor, some people may think we were prescient, but it was about kind of a fascistic election. And there was demographics that showed that people of color would be the majority in the 2040s. And so one of the parties involved used technology, CRISPR technology, to try to stop people of color from having more children.
That's a Yale invention too. CRISPR is Yale.
Well, CRISPR is, you know, there's a lot of discussion about who owns CRISPR. Is it Berkeley? Is it Yale? Is it Harvard? I think that the courts just said Harvard, but Jennifer Doudna won the Nobel Prize at Berkeley. So, but again, here's where technology and science interact, and who owns it is a big question for anthropologists, of course, and others. So I'm going to talk today about storytelling and my passion for it. So I'm a pediatrician. I went to graduate school in sociology and medical school at the other school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I was very fortunate to learn documentary filmmaking when I was a graduate student. And that took me here to LA to film school at the American Film Institute, and then back to Boston to medical school. And I kind of, you know, saw as a doctor that my job was really being a storyteller. I pulled the stories, bits and pieces of the patient's history together and tried to formulate a diagnosis, taking these diverse elements. And really good doctors are great storytellers because they don't make assumptions, but they ask questions and they try to really understand where the patient is coming from. And if you are empathetic, and a good doctor must be empathetic, then the patient will tell you things that they might not share. And you put those together into a story and come up with, one hopes, a diagnosis. So it's not just about doing tests. And then you formulate together a plan for treatment. So as a physician, I heard many, many stories, and I was really taken with the patient's stories. And as a showrunner, writer, producer, I've been manufacturing those stories that are very influenced by what I saw as a physician in training from 1991 to 96 in medical school, and then until about 2002 as a resident. While I was on ER and 2 years of SVU, I was also trying to finish my residency. My son said, he was 11 years old at that time, "You've been on call my whole life." I kind of have. So, but it really was a source for lots of material for me that I could draw on to tell the stories that I did for the first 7 years of ER and for 11 years running SVU. And I'm still trying to do it. And I'm really fortunate to be at Yale, where I'm taking this idea of telling stories to improve health and well-being. So I'm going to go through today how I think about storytelling, who's influenced me, the impact that stories can have, and then talk about the Happy Initiative and what we're doing at Yale based on some of this research on storytelling. So, storytelling for social change, I think about constantly, and I'm going to show you some evidence because, you know, we are academics, right? So we have to show you some evidence for what we have. So, the impact of stories. Stories are the currency of our lives. Our memories are stories. How we think about the future is in stories. And right now, I'm telling you stories. And without the ability to tell stories, having certain kinds of neurological disorders like Alzheimer's or Korsakoff syndrome, we lose the ability to tell stories, and we're sometimes in, if you've known someone with Alzheimer's, and sadly I'm sure most of you have because it's so prevalent, you see that they've lost their ability to tell stories, and that's so fundamentally human. So, I'm going to talk about HPV and cervical cancer because I'm a physician. And 4,200 women in the US die each year from a cancer that's preventable. And it's preventable because it's one of the few cancers that is caused by a virus. And if you get pap smear and yearly checkups, you can be diagnosed before cervical cancer becomes fatal. There are over 300,000 women a year who die of cervical cancer. So I did, fortunately, I was very fortunate to do the first study of it to assess whether a story can make a difference. And it was about cervical cancer and HPV. So this was in 2000 on ER. And I'm going to show you a clip because I do television. So we're going to go back to Juliana Margulies in 2000. And I worked with Kaiser Family Foundation and Princeton Survey Research. And I'm going to show you pretty much the whole story, which is very short. And then I'm going to show you what we learned from the study we did. And this was the first experimental study where we surveyed around 1,000 people. We published it in the journal Health Affairs in 2001. And we assessed their knowledge of cervical cancer and HPV. And now with Gardasil, which is the vaccine for cervical cancer, to prevent cervical cancer and other kinds of HPV-causing cancers, more people do know what HPV is, but still a lot of people have not been vaccinated. We then, the experiment was, the treatment I should say, was the show, and then we resurveyed a random sample of viewers, almost 1,000, a week later and 6 weeks later. So I'm going to show you this, and you can see how I try to integrate the information in a felicitous way without kind of pounding people on the head. Sometimes this portmanteau called edutainment is like, whoa, I don't do education and I don't do entertainment. I mean, yes, I do. But I don't think of it that way. I think about storytelling. Because my job isn't to teach you, nor is my job to, I think, knock you out and be a couch potato and be entertaining. So I want to do something that engages you through storytelling. So here are the clips from ER, and then I'm going to show you the results. And this, as I said, was the first time anyone really did an experimental study as opposed to a retrospective study where we asked people what they remembered.
We heard you can't tell anybody anything we say to you.
Well, that depends on what you tell me. Sex? Well, if there's no abuse involved and the guys are under 18, then everything you tell me has to remain confidential.
So you couldn't tell our parents?
No, I couldn't. Promise. Go ahead, what is it? Look, I can't help you if you don't tell me what it is.
We're afraid we might have caught something.
Well, what do you think you might have caught?
We heard some syphilis was going around in school.
I see. Why don't you girls come with me, okay?
Is Terry okay?
She's fine, she's sitting on her chairs.
They're still incorporating anticoagulant dysplasia patches. Is that syphilis dysplasia?
There's no sign of syphilis, but we have to wait for the blood test to be sure. You can go ahead and get dressed.
So I can go? No, your HIV test won't take long and I can wait. Well, am I alright?
Let's wait and see what the test says. Yeah, it looks okay, but get that pathology to the stat pap smear on this one. All right, let's get you dressed.
Oh wait, we gotta go. Bye. Sorry, we were just talking as friends.
Terry, I need to talk to Andrea privately.
Is she alright?
Just go wait in chairs, please.
Thanks.
Thanks. Andrew, we got your test results. They found some abnormal cells in your pap smear. You might have cervical cancer. We need to do a biopsy just to make sure.
Cancer? Is it caused by having sex?
Well, you get it from an infected partner. It's called HPV, human papillomavirus. But not everybody with HPV
No, you
has
can't
it.
tell my parents.
Andrea, if you have this, you need to be admitted to the hospital.
Anyway, they're in Europe. You said everything I told you was confidential.
If you're not treated, you could get very sick. We also have to inform your partner. Andrea.
I don't know who it is. I mean, which one?
Well, how many have you had?
Not sure. They have these parties.
I don't know. Both girls have been going to sex parties at school friends.
Oh my God, at their age?
I promised her I wouldn't tell you folks, and legally I can't.
Well, wait, she's a minor and she needs surgery.
Well, maybe I can talk to the lady to her parents.
Carol, I understand you don't want to break confidentiality, but this is a public health issue now. At least one of those boys is spreading HPV. And the girls at those parties all need to have pelvic exams and pap smears. So whatever she says, you also need to go to school.
Hey Malik, have you seen a girl in a school uniform?
I saw two of them, one out that door.
Damn it! What are you doing here? You nervous out, didn't you?
I need to talk to you.
Get away! You promised you, bitch!
You need to come back in.
You said there were rules made.
I know what I said, but I can't.
You lied to me.
Look, it is a lot more complicated than that. Your health is in danger, and other girls could get infected too.
Everyone's gonna know everything.
Andrea? Andrea?
Well, that was a mess. So she does come back and get treated. But it really poses all these ethical dilemmas, which is what I love about television, that it's like a three-dimensional chessboard and you have all these different positions going on, and Juliana Margulies' character is really trapped because she has promised confidentiality, and yet there's a public health problem. And how does she deal with that? And people are being exposed. This was inspired by a story I read in the Washington Post that took place in North Carolina. And so what did we find out? So we found out, did our show make a difference? And if it did, what were the findings? So over half the people who watched our show learned about health issues from the show. And they talked with friends and family about the show. A third got information about that helped them make choices. Gulp. I mean, like, that's kind of a big responsibility. They went to other sources, 1 out of 4. And 1 out of 7 went to a doctor or healthcare provider because of something they saw on our show. And this was kind of the beginning of Hollywood Health and Society, which was mentioned in my introduction, to give writers accurate information because people were believing what they saw. We went to so much effort to make it look real that we wanted people to believe they were watching people in a hospital. And so what responsibility did we have as writers and producers to be accurate? And that still is a debate that rages on today. So before the show aired, 9% could identify HPV, and as I said, I think more could now. A week later, 28% could. And then it drifted down to 16%, which is why I say that repeats are great for giving a booster. And the show is on now, again, and so all the Gen Zers and millennials say that many people have told me they're watching the show. And I think it's great because they're all in scrubs, so it doesn't look like it's outdated. I mean, the actors look a lot younger, but their clothes look exactly like hospital clothes now. So this is what shocked us. Percent of viewers who know that HPV is associated with cervical cancer or causes cervical cancer. So about 20% before the show aired, 60% after the show aired, and down to about 40%. In order to change your behavior, you have to have the information. So this is where storytelling made a difference. And now there have been many, many studies that have been done, particularly through USC, on the impact of television since our inaugural study. So what exactly makes stories have an impact? So I like to talk about going from the data to the emotion. So I find stories to tell when I find data that strikes me as surprising or shocking or needing more clarity. And then I do a story about it. So recently on Designated Survivor, I saw that 1 out of 2, this was in the New York Times, it was the cover story about 4 or 5 years ago, 1 out of 2 black men who have sex with men in the South have HIV. It's like, what? Now we can prevent HIV and we can treat it so that it's not transmissible. How can this be? So this is a question of what we call the social determinants of health. Access, cost, stigma, other social, cultural forces that are still causing the United States and some regions of the country to have higher rates of HIV than almost anywhere else in the world. So I go from the data, and then I say I go to the emotion. So what does that mean? So I'm very influenced by a psychologist at the University of Oregon named Paul Slovic. And he talks about psychic numbing and genocide. And unfortunately, this is pertinent to right now. If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. Mother Teresa was quoted by Paul Slovic in his piece, Psychic Numbing and Genocide. So why is it that at first we pay attention and then we stop paying attention, or we pay less attention, we become numb? And that's the nature of his work, and I've been very influenced by his work, as has someone like Nick Kristof, who was an op-ed writer for the New York Times, or Daniel Kahneman, the economist and Nobel Prize winner. So most people are caring, excuse me, and will exert great effort to reserve the one whose needy plight comes to their attention. But these same people often become numbly indifferent to the plight of the one who is one of many in a greater problem. And that's what Slovic has said. So if we think about Ukraine, for instance, we remember the mother who was injured and ultimately died, the pregnant mother, pregnant woman, and the baby was born and the baby died. That's indelible, and it makes us want to do something. But as we see more and more and more, unfortunately, his work shows that we often become numb. So what do we do? How do we? And for me, I do feel that storytelling is our hope, that we have to just keep telling stories. So, data and emotion. So numbers alone don't move people. So if I told you how many people have died from COVID in the United States, 900,000, you're like, whoa, what does that mean? But when you remember those individual stories you may have seen on the news or your own stories, that emotional element moves you. And this is why we love novels and movies and TV shows and music, poetry. I'm going to get to that. And that's the fundamental element of our Happy Initiative, is moving people forward to improve health and well-being through the arts and humanities, namely storytelling. And there's something about our brains, and I don't know what it is. I don't, often we hear people say it's, we're wired. I'm not sure what that means, we're wired for storytelling, but we are wired for storytelling because that's how we talk to each other. That's how we make sense of the world. But why is it that we're not, as scientists, we might be very moved by data, but in general, the population is not. And they're moved by emotion, as we have seen, in all of the struggles that we're having as a country. So psychic numbing, Slovik says, is our capacity to feel is limited. So, you may recall the boy who was washed ashore during the ongoing Syrian crisis. And so there was a viral photograph of him and Elon, and it generated global attention, and it faded. And so the question is, how do we sustain it? So if you look at this, this is a Google trend data that before September 2015, people were not looking at Elon because they didn't know who he was. And some people were looking at refugees in Syria. And then the Elon picture, boom, up huge. And then it trended down with him. We move on with our lives. But there was a higher level. There was a time to do something. And so Slovik and those of us who do this kind of work in television or movies who really want to make a difference in areas, we try to do our show that'll have an emotional impact, and then we try to build some ways to keep it going. And I'll show you how we did it in a moment in one of our shows. So we do have these times when we can act, and we can think about that with Ukraine as well now, but those times start to diminish. So the collapse of compassion is key to Slovik's work. So he did a donation experiment, and it was a story that he presented to people about a child in Malawi, I believe, who was food insecure. And then he told the story with the little boy and his sister. And then he told it about the village, and then he told it about the country. And when did people give the most donations? To the first story, the story of one. We can relate to. We can put ourselves in that position maybe through the story, and then we can imagine. I say that empathy is, curiosity is the gateway to empathy, that we are curious. And I think that's where we really fail right now in schools, is to really sustain and promote curiosity. Because without curiosity, how do we have any interest in anyone else? And so people were told this story and they're curious about this little boy, and they put themselves in his position. But when you think about a village, it's harder to do that. But when you have that one person you can think about, and then that relates to movies that have a protagonist, or books that have a protagonist, and any kind of arts or humanities, we can relate to that emotionally, and then we can use the data to support the storytelling. And I'm always really clear, I say that our stories must be grounded in the science, must be grounded with the data, so that's important, that we're not giving misinformation in our medical series or our legal series, even though this happens all the time, because people believe it. And we see this all the time now in this fight over, say, vaccinations and the internet and stories and anecdotes. So how should we value human lives? Well, we should value, I think we would all agree that every life has equal value, and that large losses are valued more. But what happens is, how do we, and this is from Slovik's work, the number of lives increase, but the value and the compassion collapse. And I'm not saying that that is monolithic. Of course we care as what's going on in the Ukraine or still in Syria, but it's numbing. And so how do we get past that? And that's a question that I'm going to address next. So here's an example of applying Slovik's ideas. How many plastic soda bottles are dumped into the ocean each year? Anybody have a guess?
10 million.
How many?
10 million.
10 million, okay.
2 billion?
2 billion. Let's see. I think it's like between 20 and 34 billion you know, it's huge, and it's had tons and tons and tons. So that number, it's like, what do we do? What do we do? I mean, it's numbing. So here's a story of what I call the story of one. And here we go. And this had a huge impact, as you may recall.
I'm coming. Speaking of it, Mr. Surgeon. Just going to be so happy. Big body.
Bless you.
Have you ever heard about tears?
Notice this.
What is it? Rocks. They're sterile rocks. Could you put them into the iodine and then we're just going to try to clean? Pero no es un poco fuerte.
Sí, yo de todo. Sí, yo estaba mordiendo, yo lo mordí que está en plástico.
He bit on it, he said it's plastic.
Eliciting compassion through affective, I mean, effective is good too, but this is affective, emotional storytelling. So what happened? Communities across the country passed ordinances banning plastic straws. And so there was something people felt they could do, and they were really motivated. This had millions and millions of views online. And so this was the story of the turtle, the one. And we could really feel for it. It's like hard to watch. And then they put the turtle back into the ocean. And this happens to, I think it's, they said 100 million marine animals a year. So we go from data to emotion, and then I think, you know, the real trick is how do we get to action? So let me give you an example of how we did this on Law and Order SVU. So I met a young woman who had been sexually assaulted. It was terrible for her course, and she underwent about a 7-hour rape kit where they swab for evidence, and it's very invasive, and often relive and have PTSD of the experience. But this is a way that we collect the evidence so that it can be used in court. And she told me she was afraid to leave her apartment because her kit had not been opened, she found. In other words, it hadn't been sent through the system, because there are a lot of people who have committed crimes in the past, and they're in the system, and they could be stopped if the rape kits had been opened. So I started to do some research, and was pretty shocked to find out that there were thousands, tens of thousands of rape kits that were unopened in the United States. So the first thing I did was write a show with Jennifer Love Hewitt as the guest star. So this is a very short scene from the show Behave, and this is Mariska, Detective Benson, talking about the problem with opening rape kits.
He said they have a backlog of 4,000 rape kits. He says he'll give me the results when he has them. Birmingham, more than 2,000 rape kits. Phoenix has 4,100 untested rape kits.
We counted almost 7,000 kits. I think there might be as many as 16,000 kits here.
Have any of them been tested?
So far, only about 1,200.
I wonder how many guys like Harrison have been stopped if those rape kits have been tested.
Until they are, it's just a victim of medical justice.
It's like we're telling them that they don't matter, and we're telling the perps that they can get away with it.
So we're telling them they don't matter, the victims, and we're telling the perps. I mean, that's really what we're saying, because we didn't open these thousands and thousands of kits. So we showed this, and then we did some outreach. So I'll go quickly through this. So this was online with NBC, and we told people, we gave them actionable steps, because often people see things, they want to do something, you want to catch them, and you want to go from you want to bridge the gap between inspiration and action. And so what can we do? So we gave them kits to go to their chief of police in their communities, or to their different assemblies or their local city councils, to demand that the rape kits be opened, and meaning tested. And so we did outreach on different foundation, where she put it out through her foundation. We did it with Participant, which does documentaries, Al Gore's documentary. They do movies as well. We did it with Nick Kristof, where we bit.ly that little piece that you just saw. He had over 1 million followers, and he says that every 2 minutes someone is raped in the United States. US law doesn't require DNA evidence to be tested. Learn more, SVU, and then the bit.ly, and then you would see that little piece that Mariska did that we just saw. And then we worked with Human Rights Watch because that was their main domestic project. And so they're the ones who developed this kit for viewers to use. And we gave them Take Part, which is part of Participant, so that told people how to do it. And so the Venn diagram of Huffington Post, Nick Kristof, you know, there it's like kind of, you're hitting the same audience. So we expanded our audience too. So we went to Good Housekeeping, US News, Ms., TV Guide, et cetera, et cetera. Today's Show, it's, you know, we had access, of course, but we took advantage of that by reaching out. And the actions that have been taken today, so there are a number of states that mandate, have cleared the backlog, and there are other states that have enacted legislative rape kit reform. So we're working, and you know, Mariska is really the one who, she did a documentary called I Am Evidence on HBO as well. So actions were taken. So this is a kind of a grassroots approach, but using storytelling to make a difference. And that's kind of, that is fundamental, that undergirds the Happy Initiative. So there are many storytelling modalities that we use, and VR is really kind of the more recent one in Meta. And so we try to take all of these different storytelling modalities at Yale, and we go into the Happy Initiative. So what is the Happy Initiative? So it's Humanities and Arts and Public Health Practice at Yale. It started by Judy Lichtman, who's a professor in the department at the School of Public Health in community epidemiology. And she's a renowned expert on stroke and heart disease in women. And she brought me in. I had done some talks at Yale a couple of years ago. The dean, Stan Berman, had brought me in, and we talked about trying to do something that brings the arts and humanities to really trenchant and intractable, often, issues in health. So what is Happy? So it's an initiative of Yale School of Public Health. We seek to leverage the power of storytelling using arts and humanities to inspire the public. And the stories, as I just showed you, are to inspire and galvanize us to advocate for change. And our courses, which I'll get to in a minute, are for graduate students and undergraduates. And we garner the power of the arts and humanities to beckon the public to embrace science and research that can improve public health. So again, grounded in the science. So our objectives, we want to bridge the complementary perspectives and contributions of humanities, arts, and public health practice to improve the health of communities, particularly New Haven. So we do a lot of work with the community of New Haven, which you're all familiar with. And we develop a plan and partnerships for an interdisciplinary program that incorporates Yale's rich and diverse resources. So I'm going to get to that. We work with about 30 different departments, galleries, and centers. And we want to offer students from all of Yale schools and colleges a unique lens into public health challenges. And we want to help them to devise solutions and break down barriers through innovative courses that leverage arts and humanities across Yale. And you know that it's not just the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, it's architecture, school of drama, music school, on and on, medical school, school of public health. So these are our partners, and this is what's so exciting, because all of these departments, galleries, and centers have a stake in wanting to improve health and do it in some kind of way. When I was working with some playwrights from the School of Drama, it was really interesting to me how many were doing something that was health related, and how they weren't really going to like the School of Public Health, where there were experts on their work, the work that they were doing. And so I was like, even though I wasn't on the faculty yet, I knew like, oh, you should go see Greg Gonzalez because he was in ACT UP and your play is about that, and you should see this person. So we're trying to really kind of galvanize the students and the faculty to work with each other to promote improving health and wellness. And we can see that we're in certainly dire straits in that area. So we have a three-pronged approach: education, collaboration, and research. I'll go into that a little bit more. So the goals of the education is to explore how we can use the humanities, as I was just trying to make the argument, using television and television stories, to promote public health and well-being, and using story building. So inclusive design and public health. So these are the three courses that we're teaching now that come out of the School of Public Health. So one is the Happy course, and that's Humanities and Arts and Public Health, and that's open to everyone. We have a lot of students in public health, but we have students from the School of Drama. We have some undergraduates taking that course, and we explore twice a week we meet and we explore different storytelling modalities and how people are using them. For instance, to write a story about EMTs, and one of our professors has written a play when she was a graduate student at Yale, and we look at all the different ways that we can tell stories and engage the public, because everybody's not interested in novels or in plays or in movies or in music, but we'll hit most everyone in some way or another. I teach in that course. I teach in this next course, Story Building, Inclusive Design and Public Health. It's a really fun course. Half of our students are architecture students, half of our students are public health students. They've never met before in terms of a course like this. And we're working in a museum in New York City, and we're studying access. And so we have 4 teams made of public health students, 2 public health students, 2 architecture students, and they look at different issues of access: the entry, the resource area, wellness like bathrooms, access, and the atrium. And we look at, access issues of if you're blind, deaf, neurodiverse, trans, in a wheelchair, a veteran, things that are not thought about in design. Now we're thinking about, like, public health students and faculty think about these things from a more of an epidemiological or from a public health perspective. The architecture students might think about it, but now they are, in terms of, how do you think about these things and make places inclusive? And so we work together and they share ideas from their expertise and learn from each other. So it's been really fun. It's taught by me and an architect named Joel Sanders, who does a program called Mixed Design, which is really renowned for doing work in access. And he also wrote a book called Stalled, which is about making bathrooms accessible. And then we have Soda Politics, and I teach that course. And that's social policy to improve public health, focused on the soda industry, using a variety of storytelling modalities, looking at stories like advertisements, and how they're really so beautifully made. There is not one moment in an advertisement that hasn't been gone over many, many times. Why is it that they all are thin? Why is it that, they are of a certain color, but not in some ways many different colors? Why is it that we ask all of these questions and we look at what the messages are? That's our that's going on right now this semester, these courses, and then we'll develop many more parts of humanities to improve health outcomes. So we want to know what works, what doesn't, what engages people, what doesn't. They are, of course, really important to our first big project. And Schwarzman's very interested in that. We have kitchens and we have stages and all kinds of places for students to practice the arts and humanities to promote health. We can have exhibitions, we can have performances. The initiative, the mission is to build a sense of belonging at Yale, providing unique opportunities to discover, connect, and create through the center's programs. And our current theme now is sleep. So why sleep? And I think what's really interesting is that when we think about health, we always hear diet and exercise, diet and exercise. But I think about it as a stool with 3 legs: diet, exercise, sleep. So much research is coming out of Yale at the medical school, the School of Nursing, sociology department, economics, on different aspects of sleep. And we look at it at the School of Public Health from social determinants of health. So we think about it as, why do some people not get sleep? What are the exposures? Noise, environmental, toxic exposures. What do we know about darkness and sleep? What do we know about brain cleaning and sleep? What do we know about children and their need for sleep? So we look at, from that public health perspective, all of the factors influencing sleep. And then we talk to folks at the School of Architecture. So Joel and I have had really interesting conversations because I say, do you all talk about bedrooms in the School of Architecture? And he goes, no, we just kind of draw them. And so it's like, wow, it's like, we should. And it's like, yeah, we should talk about these things. And the way that we do this is because of the stories, that if we use this lens of social determinants of health, we start to think more broadly in a more empathetic way about what do people undergo. Like, you think of someone. And I like to ask everybody to think about, how did you sleep last night? We all can relate to sleep because we all have good nights and bad nights and tough times and easier times. So we're going to draw on the arts and humanities, planning to do this in the fall. Connie Evans is here, and she's the development head for our school, the School of Public Health, and so we're working, so thank you, Connie, for coming. And we're going to try to do some projects around the country, and performances, discussion panels, and exhibitions that bring cutting-edge research on sleep to Yale and the New Haven community, but also outside to you all as well, because sleep is really gaining traction as the third leg of the stool, and we know that if you don't sleep well, it causes so many other problems and health problems. Alzheimer's is probably related to lack of sleep, and people say, oh, I only need 4 hours. It's like, that might not be the best thing for you. So I'm going to stop with the slides and kind of finish up by saying that there's not just one way of telling a story, as we've seen. We've seen now VR as the newest way because technology has given us that. And there are so many ways, and I don't think we should think about excluding any kind of storytelling as we try to move forward to improve health, like be it opening the backlog of rape kits, be it talking about and understanding vaccine hesitancy. And actually at Yale, we did this project with the dean, and we looked at vaccine hesitancy. We did it in conjunction with researchers from the University of Michigan. And we found that if you pose the issue as one of, to people who are against vaccination, as be a protector, that it was interesting in the data that 75% of Democrats talked about, when they were asked what was important, they said the community. And 75 and 25% of Republicans said that was important to them. And it reversed when you talked about the freedom to choose what to do. So how do you take this conflict, this issue story, and what they came up with, the folks at Yale and in Michigan, was this be a protector. It has a patriarchal element to it, but bear with me for a moment. What they did is they talked to people who didn't want to be vaccinated, and they talked in terms of their family. Like, is there someone who needed to be protected? A grandmother, someone who was immunocompromised, a child. And then telling the story in that way, as opposed to, we do know that shaming, blaming do not work. trying to like make people change because you shame them because it makes them angry. But if you talk to them about how they can help other people, particularly their families, then that might be a way to go. And that's based on the research that was done. So we take that research, as I just said, and then we start to build stories. I'll tell you one last story. I did a show with Patrick Wilson called A Gifted Man, and I was very struck. And he was a neurosurgeon who had a concierge practice, but he inherited his deceased wife's family practice, and he worked like, it was upstairs, downstairs for medicine, like the highest level of treatment and great family facility like the Venice Family Clinic where I used to work, which is the oldest and largest free-family clinic in the country. It's a great place. So I talked about expanding story parameters. So we were looking at kids in Boston who were coming in with asthma, and they were going and having an exacerbation, getting treated with nebulizers and steroids and leaving and coming back and coming back and coming back. And so we expanded the parameters. They did at Brookings and at Children's Hospital. And they looked at the before and they looked at the after story. So the before story was what was causing the exacerbation? And the after story was why are they keep coming back? So what did they find in the before story? Does anybody have it? That was fundamental to most of the kids coming in. And these were kids who were lower income kids. And nobody ever guesses this. So,
environment?
Well, it was their environment, but what did they have in common? Yes, they were exposed to antigens like cockroaches, smoke, things like that, which cause asthma exacerbations. And the answer is vacuum cleaners. So there was a lack of vacuum cleaners. And so what they did is they got funded to give vacuum cleaner prescriptions and vacuum cleaners to people. And then for the parameter exiting the hospital, a nurse went to the homes and said to the kid, where's your puffer? And if the kid couldn't find it, it was like, okay, let's put it into place and make sure we know where it is. And so what happened is, as you can imagine, the number of kids entering the hospital plummeted and the cost plummeted because we looked at the story before and after. We didn't just focus on, oh, these kids keep coming in and we gotta just keep treating them. So this was using the data, and then I put it into the show. So all these people are coming in with vacuum cleaners and Patrick's like, what's going on here? And it's like environmental health but it put that out there into the zeitgeist, I hope. So those are ways that we use the data to tell stories, and we got to tell many stories over and over so that they stick. But telling that emotional story is really, I think, the key. Using the arts and humanities is the way that we're going to do it at Yale. So thank you.
Thank you all very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Dr. Bear. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and we're going to come back with a talk back with both of our faculty members and Mindy Marks, who is our Senior Director for Regional Club. So quick 5-minute break, and then we'll have a talk back and a lovely reception. So 5 minutes. Thank you.
so much for sticking with us through the day. We know for many of you this is a first in terms of an in-person event. I'm Mindy Marks, as Stephanie mentioned. I am Yale class of 2000, and I'm the Senior Director for Regional Clubs. Is there another 2000 there? That's wonderful. I'm not going to start calling out residential colleges because that always gets really tricky. Slippery slope. But yes, I'm the Senior Director for Yale Regional Clubs, and I work out of the New Haven office. And we are going to be moderating the talk here. So I'm going to start with a question, and then we're going to immediately jump into your audience questions if you have them. I know many of you are excited to connect with our professors, and so we're going to give you space for that. So over the course of these last 2 years due to the pandemic, people have definitely had the opportunity to connect with one another in ways that they would not have necessarily been able to do before because of geography or timing and travel and such. So this has resulted in a lot of unique interactions. And I just want to know, how has the boom of these interactions influenced your work, if it has, and if so, in what ways?
You put that so much more positively than I feel like I would have an experience. I think so, as someone who was writing about virtual reality while this was going down, I think a lot of people expected me to have some kind of profound takeaway about like what it meant that we were all living our social worlds online. And kind of my biggest takeaway was, yeah, this is not a future I want. Like, I really kind of, I was kind of ambivalent about social VR and like kind of virtual interactions during it, and like whereas in one sense there was of course this amazing opportunity to reconnect and to be part of conversations that otherwise wouldn't have been possible because we were convening in online spaces. But the disconnect I felt with my most immediate community was such a sacrifice, and particularly in the classroom, like we taught for 2.5 semesters entirely online, and this fall when we were back in the classroom finally, it was, even with our masks on, it was a collective exhale. Like the students were so happy to be back. I was so happy to be back. Like it had been a 1.5 years since I really got to know the students I was teaching. Like that kind of more personal engagement just didn't happen during the pandemic. And I personally feel like I'm not willing to trade the breadth of engagement that I got for the depth of engagement that I lost. I'd much rather have the depth. So again, sorry, you started so positively.
You know, without the technology, we really would have been lost because we would have just been trapped in, you know, our little spaces. So there was good, but as you were saying, you lose the improvisational elements of our lives. And so when I was teaching this semester, students would come up afterwards, or some people just came up afterwards and said, oh, I have this question, or I really thought about this. And Zoom is really tough to do that. Like you can't just kind of do a kind of tap on the shoulder with Zoom. And so you lose that kind of unpredictable element of life that is so enriching. And we were talking about Sherry Turkle's work, because I just, you know, she's a psychologist at MIT, and she's written a lot about how social media, particularly texting, gives us the ability to reach out all the time, but it's all very curated. There's no, you can curate exactly what you want to say or not say. And when we're gesturing, like right now, when we're gesturing and looking and talking and connecting, we can't do that with texting right now or things like that. And so we lose this human quality that I think we evolved over millions of years to have this kind of connection. You know, you're nodding, and I'm like then reinforced. It's like, and it's hard in terms of, you know, smiling or if someone's frowning and all those things. You can see that in Zoom, but you're distanced. And so there's something about what we are as humans that technology might come between us. I don't want to say the word interfere. I mean, what are your, you know, so it's like there's really good things that happen because we got to stay in touch and have birthday parties still and things like that. And I'm worried about mental health issues that we keep hearing about, and loneliness, and things where you just, we know that people tend to live longer if they have social communities. And so what is it about being that kind of animal and interacting? What are your thoughts?
Well, you brought it, you almost said interfere, and I would say the word is interface and mediation, right? It's very different to engage without interface, without mediation, than it is through interface and through mediation. That's a different form of sociality.
Right, and we wouldn't have the same kind of conversation right now, where I take your cues, you take my cues, I can say to you, oh, what do you think about that? It's harder to do that on Zoom. There's this formality, and there's an enrichment from that, or an enriching kind of experience, and yet I wouldn't, get rid of Zoom. But it's hard, I had to pitch some shows on Zoom, and it's really difficult because people get really bored. It's like you're trying to get them, and so we have like Zoom now, we do pitches to the networks with pictures, and then it gets fancier and fancier when it's really about that engagement where you're in the room and you lose something. And so I recommend Sherry Turkle's books because she really kind of grapples with what does it mean to be a human being, what does it mean to communicate, and what is VR going to do? So I wanted to ask you that, so I could. Is it all right if I ask a question?
You can.
Okay. So let's go down this road a little bit more. So do you think VR enhances, does nothing, takes away from, or is it just a different experience from experiences that we're used to having?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. VR is a powerful experience. It's such a hard thing to describe. There's a quote, something like, I know I'm forgetting, dancing about architecture, right? Like, there's like it's very challenging to actually convey the experience of VR to someone who has not done VR. It's like beyond kind of the words that I have. Writing a book about VR has been, I've just known that it is inadequate. There's no way I'd be able to describe what that experience is. So I always recommend people to actually try like a recent VR experience to just understand what it is. And what it mostly is sensorial overwhelm, because you're fully surrounded visually and orally, and it does truly give you a sense of being there. I had done an experience where it was actually earthquake simulation, and there was like a shaking floor, and it was like, how do you train yourself to have the instinct so you would know what to do in an earthquake? And there was like, in the virtual room, there was a table, and so I got on my knees and went under the table, because that's what you were supposed to do to like win the simulation. And the VR experience ended, and the person was like, okay, you can stand up now, you can take off the headset. I was on my hands and knees, so I had to stand up, and I crawled out from under the table, which did not exist, of course, right? And like, when I like to stand up through the table is something that was uncanny. So there definitely is something unique about the VR experience, but it can't be the same as the in-person experience. I don't think I necessarily have a strong feeling of, is it better or worse, but I do know it's different.
Right. You mentioned Nandila Pena, and I've gone through some of her VR experiences. And so from a public health perspective, domestic violence, we think accounts for at least 1 in 3 women going to the emergency room. So it's a huge public health problem. And so I did this VR experience where I'm in the middle of a domestic violence dispute, and it's terrifying. And it may be, I don't know, we have to do now the research, like, will this help policymakers? I mean, if you're a policymaker and you're in there and you're seeing and it's really recorded, it was recorded from cell phones, and it's the real deal. So it's really scary. And you're there, and it's like something that you don't hopefully experience, but you're put into someone else's shoes, and you can empathize, like, wow, this is something we have to do. So I'm really interested in, like, how do we use VR for policy when so much policy is just talk, but we don't know what people are experiencing. Like, we stopped paying for child support that we were paying for during the pandemic, and we took more kids out of poverty than ever, and now kids are going back into poverty. So what if you used some kind of VR and you were in like this kid's world? Would that help policymakers be more empathetic? I think it might. I mean, I was certainly more aware of domestic violence and how it starts and how it gets out of control and things like that with the work that Nani did.
So I definitely want to take time to catch some questions from the audience, because I know we are running a little bit over, but if anyone has questions, you can call me, you can get the mic to you. We can move this way. So let's start with Kevin and we'll just go across the room.
Thank you so much. With your work on storytelling, you mentioned how you're engaging other departments like architecture or medicine who might not be familiar with storytelling to how to tell stories. What does that mean to them? Like, when you say, let's tell stories, guys, like, how do they get that? Like, what are the elements of storytelling that they need to know to be able to actually tell a story through architecture or through a joint program?
Well, we engage, that's a great question, we engage with our friends. So people who are storytellers. So I know Joel, and I know his work, and I know the work that he had done on bathrooms, which was just transformative. And so we reached out to him. Or there's a professor at the School of Medicine, Gretchen Berland, who is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner and a filmmaker. And she does work like, she made a film called Wheels, which was people in wheelchairs. So we first we find our affinity groups. So we go to places, architecture, the School of Music, School of Drama, the medical school, and find people now. And we find our friends, and then we hope that it will ignite others. So we don't try to just kind of create air, but we are finding people who are very like-minded, because look, Yale really is, if you want to do arts and humanities, you can brag and say that Yale is the best place to do it. And so there are a lot of like-minded people at Yale who want to tell stories, and they do it in their own departments. And when you come to them and say, hey, like to Joel, like he's already doing this course in Access, and I say, can we bring a storytelling part to it, so what the students do is they have to use a storytelling modality to present their work to funders. And what kind of story are you going to use? Are you going to use the traditional story of pictures, drawings, or are you going to bring in people? Are you going to do a participatory work? Are you going to, then we get into really fun brainstorming. Are you going to ask people who have access issues to use their cell phones to record these things and then bring those participatory elements into it? So it's an engagement effort early on to build support with people who are already doing it, because Joel's already doing it. People are already doing it in lots of places.
We had a hand up, individual right here.
Hi, my question is about the research process. So how do you go about conducting outreach and building relationships with entities or institutions you don't have existing relationships with? So for instance, those companies that are in VR in Los Angeles or those investment firms, and for Dr. Barrett, the institutions that aren't.
I have a lot of success with cold emails. I think a lot of what my purpose is in the end actually goes back to what Neil was just saying, is to tell someone's story, right? That's kind of what I desire to do when I enter a place. And I think a lot of people want their stories told, right? They want to have the work that they're doing acknowledged. That's part of kind of a broader set of ideas. So And so something I learned about the difference between networking in Los Angeles versus New York, which someone in LA actually had to tell me for me to really appreciate, is that in LA it's very easy to get the first meeting, and then it's harder to get the second meeting, but in New York and other places it's very hard to get the first meeting. But once you get the first meeting, it's a lot easier to get the second meeting. So it's actually just a different mode of networking that I had to learn when I got here. Like I was used to more of the East Coast, like really having to work hard for that. But so part of like how do you get into a new space is like actually learning some of the local culture in terms of how the networking is established and like and how to then kind of be in that vibe to let people get you in. But it's like so much easier than you would imagine. I did have to sign a lot of NDAs. I'm just hoping no one remembers that I signed those. No one say that.
I think about, I said this before, affinity groups. So instead of just like throwing a bucket of water out there and hoping that a few drops land somewhere, I think like, where are my, like I just said with like-minded folks doing the research, who are my affinity groups? So I did a show, a documentary called If You Build It, about kids who use design thinking to build a farmer's market to save their town in the poorest county of North Carolina. And so I thought, well, I'll go to principals meetings across the country, like national principal meetings or national, workshop, shop classes and things like that. And I'll hit people who have some affinity with what I'm doing, as opposed to just kind of going out there and thinking things. And I can be very creative about it because there's different kinds of affinity groups. But that's what I think about. And then in terms of funding and foundations, I think of whom I've worked with before, and I make this deck like you just saw about Happy, and then we send it out, and then we have them respond. And that's really what we're going to do. We're going to go to funders to do that. So I target people. Maybe I'll change some of the slides a little bit, but I think affinity is really important because they already are interested. Like, so for instance, I'm going to go to the Sloan Foundation. Why? Because they do science and they do performance. They're the foundation that does that more than anyone else. So that would be ideal. But I might not go to some other places because it's such a long shot and I don't have all the time in the world. So I really think about where's the biggest bang for my buck.
Thank you. So Steph, I think we actually may only have time for one or two more, depending on okay. So.
Thank you, Mindy and Stephanie and Anita and everyone for dreamy, another wonderful Yale alumni event. And it's so amazing to hear you talk about these topics. I was given an office this week in the sleep research group, and I have a bachelor's degree in theater. So it's a little crazy, but this is my fourth career. I was at the Yale medical conference yesterday in New Haven, and I was asked if I would co-chair it next year, be under consideration for that. And bringing things like public health to sleep and finding a way to tell stories about that to inspire radical change. We have an emerging field of medicine that we're in discussion to start research with, and the pediatric group of sleep and the adult group that has a way to prevent sleep apnea and to some extent reverse it. It will radically transform a great deal of medicine. I'm so excited to be so welcome. Anyway, your beautiful Happy project you talk about, the work is so inspiring, and I'm just really so touched by this. It's emotional and beautiful. I was at a Yale Alumni Association, Yale International Alliance event in Rome, a Global Leaders Forum last month. Mindy was a part of it. It was so inspiring with 50 leaders from around the world. I got recruited to be under consideration to be on the board, and I'd given two asks to do that. One is to organize storytelling and this emerging field we working on functional therapy. So be really exciting to discuss that further. And the second ask was, maybe I'll get a chance to speak a little later, was to form a bureau for a task force for helping Ukraine that Yale would be a part of. So,
I love your cheerleading, Mark, as a former cheerleader at Yale. I do want to get another question in, so thank you for that, and thank you for the praise. I appreciate that.
There is a sleep course, so there is a course taught where it's an undergraduate course, and they do, so you should look into that course.
Mayor Krieger recruited me to Yale. He's a mentor.
So he's the one who's teaching that course, and he works with us too.
Okay, and one more.
You talk about you don't like teaching over Zoom as much as you do the other. Can't we have the technology people make it much better instead of saying no or that? Because we who are not back there have enjoyed so many of the classes, and we would like more. And let's make it, surely the technology people can start working on that, not just accept Zoom as the final arbiter.
I think that's back to the question you asked before, which is what is the distinction between an experience in person and even a high fidelity virtual experience? And they're just still different. And part of me loves that, right? I kind of like the idea that technology probably won't be able to replicate the magic of being in person, that there will always be something necessary about coming together. But I also really hear you on part of what has made the silver lining of this period has been that inclusivity and this ability to reach more people and kind of attend more spaces. So I very much hope that the higher ups at Yale provide that extended opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry we have to cut off because we want you all to be able to enjoy the reception and get to know one another better. And you may have the opportunity still to talk with our professors if you're able to stick with us for a few extra minutes after as well. I'm going to turn things back over to Stephanie, who will be closing us out.
I think we're just saying thank you, and please do talk to Professor Masari and Dr. Barrett as they join us for our reception. We're just really grateful for everyone coming out today, spending your afternoon with us, and to be physically here in person in such a beautiful space with all of you. So thank you kindly for your